April 26, 1917, Washington, D.C. Major General Hugh Scott, Chief of Staff of the United States Army, stood at the window of his office in the War Department building, gazing out at the spring greenery of the Potomac Hills. Behind him, on a massive oak desk, lay a telegram from French Commander-in-Chief Marshal Joffre, a desperate plea for help, for troops, for any troops. France was bleeding out. Britain was suffocating. Germany was preparing for the decisive blow. Scott knew the numbers by heart, and they were merciless. The entire regular army of the United States numbered 127,519 men, fewer than had died in a single day on the Somme the previous summer. The National Guard added another 180,000, but most had never held a rifle under enemy fire. The country had no modern artillery, no tanks, no aviation worthy of the name. Industry operated on peacetime orders. The officer corps was two-thirds staffed, and the officers themselves had experience only in police operations in the Philippines and chasing bandits in Mexico. In 20 days, Congress would pass the Conscription law. In 18 months, just 18 months, 2 million American soldiers would be in France, with another 2 million training in camps across the United States. They would be armed, clothed, fed, trained, and thrown into the bloodiest offensive of the war. They would break the back of the German war machine not through brilliant strategy, not through tactical miracles, but through pure, relentless arithmetic of human mass. A flood of manpower that the enemy simply could not stop. But on that April day, standing at the window, General Scott did not yet know this. He knew only one thing: America had 18 months to create an army from nothing, or lose the war before truly entering it. To understand the scale of what America accomplished, one must first understand how utterly unprepared the nation was for modern industrial warfare in April 1917. The regular army numbered 127,088 men, ranking 17th in the world, behind Portugal. These troops were scattered across 161 posts, most in the American West and overseas territories. The largest concentration of troops anywhere was the 6,000-man garrison in the Philippines. There was no division-sized formation in existence. The largest tactical unit was the regiment, and most regiments had never operated together as a cohesive force. The National Guard provided another 181,620 men on paper. But the reality was grimmer. Most Guard units trained 1 evening per week and 2 weeks per summer. Equipment was antiquated. In some states, Guard units still drilled with Civil War-era Springfield rifles. When the Guard was federalized in July 1917, inspectors found units with no machine guns, no mortars, no field telephones, and officers who had never read a tactical manual written after 1898. The officer shortage was catastrophic. The regular army had 5,791 officers, enough to lead 127,000 men in peacetime garrison duty, wholly insufficient for an army that would need to grow to 4 million. Worse, the officer corps was aged, and promotion had been glacial. The average company commander was 43 years old. Many battalion commanders were in their 50s, having spent decades commanding the same 100 men at remote frontier posts. What Scott confronted that spring morning was not merely a military problem, but an industrial one. The transformation of the United States Army from April 1917 to November 1918 would not be remembered for tactical innovation or strategic genius. It would be remembered for something far more brutal and effective: the conversion of America's industrial capacity. Its factories, its railroads, its organizational systems. into a machine for mass-producing soldiers at a rate no nation in history had ever achieved. The German High Command understood firepower. They understood fortification. They understood the grinding calculus of attrition warfare. What they could not anticipate, what no military establishment in Europe could fully comprehend, was the speed at which American industrial methodology could be applied to human beings. Ford's assembly line had revolutionized automobile production. Now that same principle, standardization, systematization, relentless throughput, would be applied to turning farmers, clerks, and factory workers into combat soldiers. The mathematics were straightforward and devastating. Germany, after 3 years of total war, could no longer replace its losses at the rate it suffered them. Its manpower pool was exhausted. France had lost an entire generation. Britain scraped the bottom of its reserves. Into this equation of mutual exhaustion, America would inject a variable that changed everything. An effectively unlimited supply of fresh troops arriving at a rate of 250,000 per month by mid-1918. Not better troops, not more experienced troops, simply more troops, in numbers that rendered German tactical superiority increasingly irrelevant. This was the transformation Scott faced, converting American industrial supremacy into military victory through the mass production of the Doughboy. There was no general staff worthy of the name. The War Department in 1917 employed fewer than 300 officers in Washington, most engaged in bureaucratic administration rather than operational planning. There was no logistics section capable of coordinating the movement of millions of men. There was no training doctrine for mass armies. The last time America had fielded an army of over 1 million men was 1865, and institutional memory of that mobilization had died with the veterans. Industrial capacity for war production was nearly zero. American factories in April 1917 were producing 600 Springfield rifles per month. French factories, after 3 years of wartime optimization, produced 26,000 rifles per month. America had no capacity to produce artillery pieces. The last field gun had been manufactured in 1898. There were no steel helmet factories, no gas mask factories, no trench warfare equipment of any kind. The German assessment was coldly logical. Even if America could recruit millions of men, training them would take years. Equipping them would take longer. Transporting them across a U-boat-infested Atlantic was nearly impossible. And once in France, these green troops would be slaughtered by veteran German divisions who had perfected defensive warfare through 4 years of blood. By the time American forces became combat effective, Germany would have already won the war in the West. This assessment was not unreasonable. It was simply wrong. Wrong because it underestimated the speed at which American industrial systems could be repurposed for human production. The Selective Service Act, signed on May 18, 1917, was not merely a conscription law. It was the blueprint for an industrial process that would transform American manhood into military manpower at assembly line speed. Registration day was June 5, 1917. In a single day, 136,000 men between ages 21 and 30 registered at 4,500 local boards across the nation. The system was designed with industrial efficiency in mind. Standardized forms, local processing, centralized record keeping. Each man received a registration number. Each was classified by occupation, dependence, and physical fitness. The entire male population of military age was cataloged, sorted, and made ready for systematic extraction. The first draft lottery was held on July 20, 1917, Secretary of War Newton Baker, blindfolded, drew capsule number 258 from a glass bowl. Across the country, men holding registration number 258 became the first draftees. The system was impersonal, mechanical, and devastatingly efficient. By the end of July, 687,000 men had been called. By December, 1 million. By war's end, 10,296 men would be inducted through selective service, 72% of the total force. But conscription was only the first stage of the conveyor. The drafted men had to be transformed into soldiers, and this required an infrastructure that did not exist in April 1917. The solution was characteristically American. Build it fast, build it big, and build it standardized. In summer 1917, the War Department ordered construction of 32 training camps, 16 cantonments for National Army draftees, and 16 tent camps for National Guard units. Each cantonment was designed to house 40,000 men and train them simultaneously. This was not barracks construction in the European sense. Permanent stone buildings meant to last decades. These were temporary cities, built in weeks using standardized plans designed to process soldiers like Ford processed automobiles. Camp Devens in Massachusetts broke ground on June 18, 1917. 6,000 civilian workers labored around the clock. Lumber arrived by the trainload. Barracks, mess halls, warehouses, hospitals, headquarters buildings, and stables rose from empty fields at astonishing speed. By September 1st, 75 days after groundbreaking, the camp received its first 20,000 trainees. The total construction time was faster than it took to build a single barracks complex in pre-war Army standards. The scale was staggering. Camp Pike in Arkansas covered 52,000 acres, larger than the District of Columbia. It housed 100,000 men at peak capacity. Camp Lee in Virginia processed 60,000 soldiers simultaneously. Camp Grant in Illinois, Camp Sherman in Ohio, Camp Funston in Kansas, each a temporary city larger than most American towns, each built in a matter of weeks. The design was ruthlessly functional. Barracks were identical wooden structures, each housing 150 men in rows of iron bunks. Mess halls served 1,000 men per sitting. Drill fields were measured and marked with geometric precision. Every camp followed the same layout, the same construction standards, the same organizational logic. A sergeant transferred from Camp Devens to Camp Lee would find the latrines in the exact same location relative to the barracks. Standardization was not about comfort, it was about throughput. By December 1917, the cantonment system had capacity for 1,800,000 men. Not housed in permanent facilities meant to last, but processed through a system designed for maximum speed. The average training cycle was 6 months from induction to embarkation. Recruits arrived as civilians, they left as soldiers. The system did not produce elite troops, it produced adequate troops in overwhelming numbers. The training program was designed around industrial efficiency rather than military tradition. There was no time for the slow, methodical instruction that characterized European professional armies. The goal was not to create career soldiers, but to mass-produce combat-ready infantry in the shortest possible time. The process began with reception and classification. Inductees arrived by train, were issued uniforms and equipment from standardized supply depots, and underwent physical and mental examinations. Those with specialized skills, electricians, mechanics, clerks, were channeled into technical services. The rest went to infantry. Basic training followed a rigid 16-week schedule. Week 1, military courtesy, basic drill, personal hygiene. Week 2, rifle nomenclature and basic marksmanship. Week 3, squad tactics. Week 4, company movements. Every week was planned, every hour accounted for. Instructors followed printed lesson plans. Training was broken down into standardized modules that could be delivered by any competent sergeant, regardless of prior teaching experience. The shortage of experienced instructors was solved through industrial multiplication. The Army identified 2,000 regular Army NCOs with combat experience and designated them as cadre. Each was assigned to train 40 new instructors in a 6-week course. Those at 80,000 new instructors then trained the incoming recruits. The system compounded expertise geometrically. One experienced sergeant could, through this cascading structure, ultimately influence the training of 10,000 men. Physical conditioning followed factory logic. Companies conducted synchronized calisthenics, hundreds of men performing identical movements in unison. Route marches increased in distance on a fixed schedule. 5 miles in week 2, 10 miles in week 6, 20 miles with full pack in week 12. The goal was not individual excellence, but minimum acceptable standard across the entire cohort. Marksmanship training revealed both the system's efficiency and its limitations. Recruits fired a total of 114 rounds during basic training, barely enough to achieve basic competency. Contrast this with the German Army's pre-war standard of 300 practice rounds per year, or the British emphasis on individual marksmanship that required 1,000 rounds to qualify as a rifleman. American training aimed lower. Teach the recruit to load, aim, and fire without killing himself or his comrades. Accuracy would come from volume of fire, not individual skill. Tactical training emphasized the infantry assault, the one mission every doughboy would perform. Squads practiced advancing under imaginary fire, taking cover, rushing forward in bounds. Companies rehearsed coordinating with supporting machine gun sections. Battalions conducted set-piece attacks on mock trench systems. The training was repetitive, formulaic, and effective enough. Recruits would not emerge as tactical artists. They would emerge knowing how to follow orders, advance when told to advance, and dig when told to dig. The entire system was designed to minimize variation. Training schedules were identical across all 32 camps. A private in the 77th Division at Camp Upton, New York, received the same instruction, fired the same number of rounds, and marched the same distances as a private in the 91st Division at Camp Lewis, Washington. This standardization was essential for mass production. It allowed the War Department to predict with industrial precision when divisions would be ready for deployment. By early 1918, the training camps operated at maximum capacity. Every week, 50,000 new inductees entered the system. Every week, 50,000 trained soldiers emerged. It was a human assembly line, crude but functional, producing soldiers at a rate that dwarfed anything in military history. The men who filled these camps represented a demographic cross-section of America, unlike any previous military force. The 1917-1918 Army was not a volunteer force of adventurers and professionals. It was a conscripted mass of ordinary men, extracted from civilian life by systematic industrial process. The average doughboy was 22 years old, stood 5'7" tall, and weighed 141 pounds. Smaller than the modern American male, reflecting the nutritional standards of the era. He had completed 8 years of education, more than most European conscripts, but far from sophisticated. If he was native-born white, he likely came from a farm or small town. If he was foreign-born, he probably spoke English poorly or not at all. 18% of inductees were foreign-born. The camps held Italians who had fled poverty in Sicily, Poles who had escaped Russian conscription, Greeks from Anatolia, Jews from the Pale of Settlement. Many had been in America less than 5 years. Some had not yet completed citizenship. The Army created separate development battalions for non-English speakers, where basic commands were taught phonetically before military training began. 13% were illiterate. The Army established special schools within the camps to teach basic reading and writing, not from humanitarian concern, but because an illiterate soldier could not read orders, signs, or warnings. These schools operated on accelerated schedules. 60 days to achieve functional literacy sufficient for military service. Approximately 370,000 draftees, 13% of the total, were African American. They were segregated into separate units, trained in separate camps, commanded almost exclusively by white officers, and assigned primarily to labor and stevedore battalions. Only 2 combat divisions, the 92nd and 93rd, were composed of black troops, and these were regarded with skepticism by the War Department and outright hostility by many white officers. The 93rd Division was eventually parceled out to the French Army, which was more willing to employ black soldiers in combat roles. The systematic racism embedded in the conscription and training system was not incidental. It was policy. What united this disparate mass was not common culture, not shared values, not even common language. What united them was the industrial process that extracted them from civilian life, processed them through standardized training, and shipped them to France on a schedule determined by logistical capacity rather than military readiness. The flood of manpower created a crisis the War Department had anticipated but could not solve. There were not enough weapons to arm them. American industry in 1917 was a manufacturing colossus, producing more steel, more coal, more automobiles than any nation on earth. But it produced virtually no military equipment. Converting civilian factories to military production required time, retooling machinery, training workers, establishing supply chains for specialized materials. The Army could produce soldiers faster than it could produce rifles. The Springfield M1903 rifle was the standard American weapon, an excellent bolt-action rifle, accurate and reliable. In April 1917, production stood at 600 rifles per month across 2 arsenals. The War Department contracted with private manufacturers to expand production, but retooling took months. By November 1917, monthly production reached 10,000 rifles. By mid-1918, 40,000 per month. This was a remarkable expansion, but wholly inadequate. The Army was inducting 200,000 men per month. At 40,000 rifles per month, it would take 5 months to arm a single month's worth of inductees. The solution was improvisation and dependence on allies. The Army adopted the M1917 Enfield rifle, a modified British design that American factories could produce using existing tooling. It was inferior to the Springfield in accuracy and durability, but it could be mass-produced immediately. By war's end, 2,200,000 Enfield rifles had been manufactured, more than twice the number of Springfields. Most doughboys trained with one rifle and fought with another. Machine guns were worse. The Army entered the war with 100 machine guns, mostly obsolete models. American industry had no experience producing modern automatic weapons. The War Department adopted the French Hotchkiss and Chauchat designs, then attempted to manufacture them under license. Production was plagued by delays, quality problems, and incompatible parts. By the Armistice, American factories had produced only 57,000 machine guns, a fraction of requirements. The AEF in France fought predominantly with French and British machine guns, supplied by the Allies and operated by American soldiers trained on weapons they had never seen during stateside training. Artillery was a complete failure. America had no modern artillery industry. Attempts to produce French 75mm guns and 155mm howitzers under license failed repeatedly. By November 1918, not a single American-manufactured artillery piece had reached France. Every artillery shell fired by American forces was produced in French or British factories. American artillerymen trained on wooden logs, carved to resemble guns, then learned to operate actual French weapons after arriving in France. Tanks, aircraft, gas masks, steel helmets, trench mortars, all came from Allied production. The AEF fought with French Renault tanks, French Espad and British Sopwith aircraft, British helmets, and French gas masks. This dependence was not a minor inconvenience. It was a strategic vulnerability that would have crippled the American war effort had the Allies been unable or unwilling to supply their equipment. But here the calculus of mass conscription proved its value. What America lacked in equipment, it compensated for with manpower. The Allies were desperately short of men, but had vast stockpiles of weapons from years of wartime production. America had millions of men, but no weapons. The exchange was mutually beneficial. America would supply the soldiers. France and Britain would supply the tools. Weapons were one problem. Transportation was another. 2 million men had to cross 3,000 miles of ocean, through waters patrolled by German U-boats that had sunk 5 million tons of Allied shipping in 1917 alone. The United States entered the war with a merchant marine insufficient for the task. The solution, again, was industrial mass production. The Emergency Fleet Corporation, established in April 1917, ordered construction of 15,000 tons of shipping, more than the entire British merchant fleet. Shipyards expanded from 30 to 91. Employment in shipbuilding increased from 45,000 to 380,000 workers. The results were mixed. Traditional riveted construction was too slow. The Fleet Corporation adopted fabricated steel construction, welding pre-made sections together. Another application of assembly line logic to a traditionally craft-based industry. But even with these methods, new ships took months to complete. The first emergency fleet vessels did not enter service until late 1918, too late to affect the war. The immediate solution was commandeering. The U.S. Navy seized 91 German ships interned in American ports on April 6, 1917. The day war was declared. These ships, renamed and crewed by American sailors, became the initial core of the transport fleet. British and French ships were pressed into service, carrying American troops on return voyages from delivering supplies to Europe. Luxury liners were converted to troop ships. The Leviathan, the George Washington, the Mount Vernon, each capable of carrying 10,000 men per voyage. The convoy system, adopted in May 1917 under British pressure, proved remarkably effective. Troop transports sailed in groups of 8 to 12 ships, surrounded by destroyer escorts, following zigzag courses at high speed. U-boat attacks on escorted convoys were rare and largely ineffective. Of the 2,079,880 American soldiers transported to France, only 637 were lost to submarine attack, a negligible casualty rate of 0.03%. The transportation schedule became a logistics triumph. In May 1917, 12,000 troops sailed for France. In May 1918, 245,000 troops, a 20-fold increase. June 1918 saw 278,000 embarkations. July reached 306,000, more than 10,000 soldiers per day leaving American ports. This was mass transportation on a scale never before attempted. The entire British Expeditionary Force of 1914, 160,000 men, was smaller than a single month's American shipments in summer 1918. The math was brutal for Germany. In spring 1918, Germany launched 5 massive offensives. gambling everything on breaking the Allied lines before American numbers became overwhelming. German stormtroopers achieved tactical breakthroughs, advancing 40 miles in some sectors, the deepest penetration since 1914. But each offensive burned through irreplaceable veteran divisions. German casualties in spring 1918 approached 1 million men. And while Germany bled, America shipped fresh divisions at a rate of 8 per month. By July 1918, there were 1 million American soldiers in France. By September, 1.8 million. By November, 2 million. The rate of arrival exceeded German planners' worst predictions. More importantly, it exceeded Germany's capacity to inflict casualties. The German army could kill American soldiers. It could not kill them faster than they arrived. The Doughboys arrived in France trained for a war that no longer existed. American doctrine in 1917 was based on the concept of open warfare, a term that meant different things to different officers, but generally emphasized mobility, individual initiative, and rifle marksmanship. This doctrine was shaped by American military experience. Colonial warfare in the Philippines, border skirmishes in Mexico, and study of the Civil War and Franco-Prussian War. These were wars of movement, maneuver, and decisive battle. General John J. Pershing, commander of the AEF, was a fervent believer in open warfare doctrine. He had commanded cavalry in the West, infantry in the Philippines, and a punitive expedition into Mexico. He had never experienced industrial warfare. He believed, genuinely, deeply, that American soldiers, trained in marksmanship and imbued with offensive spirit, would break the stalemate through aggressive assault. The reality of the Western Front in 1917 bore no resemblance to this vision. The front was a continuous system of fortifications stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. 400 miles of trenches, barbed wire, machine gun nests, artillery positions, and fortified villages. Attacking across no man's land meant advancing through artillery barrages that could fire 100,000 shells in a single preparatory bombardment. Then against machine guns firing 600 rounds per minute. Then into trenches held by defenders who had perfected the art of killing attackers for 3 years. The French and British had learned, through catastrophic losses, how to fight this war. Infantry assaults required meticulous coordination with artillery, using creeping barrages to suppress defenders. Attacks advanced in waves, with reserves ready to exploit breakthroughs. Tanks provided mobile firepower to destroy machine gun positions. Aircraft spotting allowed artillery to adjust fire in real time. Success required technical proficiency, coordination across multiple arms, and careful planning. Pershing rejected much of this. He insisted American soldiers be trained in rifle marksmanship rather than relying on supporting weapons. He resisted integrating American divisions into Allied armies, fearing they would be wasted in the attritional grind of trench warfare. He demanded that American forces operate as an independent army under American command, and he insisted they would attack differently, with courage, initiative, and the rifle. The collision between doctrine and reality was catastrophic. The first major test came in June 1918 at Belleau Wood, a square mile of forest and rocky outcroppings northeast of Château-Thierry. The 2nd Division, including the 4th Marine Brigade, was ordered to clear German forces from the wood. These were some of the best trained American units, regulars and Marines who had received months of instruction. They attacked with courage and determination. They also attacked with tactics that would have been appropriate in 1898, but were suicidal in 1918. The Marines advanced in formation, lines of men moving forward across open wheat fields. German machine guns, positioned in the woods with interlocking fields of fire, opened up at 800 yards. Men fell in rows. Company commanders ordered the advance to continue. Men ran forward, more fell. In the first hour, the 5th Marine Regiment suffered 1,087 casualties, more than the entire regiment had suffered in its previous 143-year history. The Marines eventually took Belleau Wood, but not through superior tactics or open warfare doctrine. They took it through sheer stubborn persistence and overwhelming numbers. For every Marine who fell, another took his place. German defenders, outnumbered and exhausted, eventually withdrew. The Americans claimed victory. The cost was 9,777 casualties, including 1,811 dead, to capture 1 square mile of forest. French observers were appalled. A French colonel, watching Marine formations advance upright across open ground, reportedly said, "They are magnificent, but it is not war." German defenders were impressed by American courage and horrified by American waste. A captured German officer noted in his diary, "The Americans fight with no regard for casualties. They advance in thick lines that make perfect targets. They absorb losses that would break any European unit, then continue advancing. This is not tactics. This is human mass applied as a weapon." He was exactly correct. What he witnessed at Belleau Wood was not tactical incompetence, though there was plenty of that. What he witnessed was the fundamental logic of American mobilization. Numerical superiority rendered tactical sophistication less essential. The 2nd Division could afford 9,777 casualties because there were 20 fresh divisions training in the United States to replace it. Germany could not afford equivalent losses. That was the arithmetic that mattered. By September 1918, Pershing finally had what he demanded: an independent American army of 550,000 men, operating under American command in its own sector of the front. The Saint-Mihiel salient was a bulge in the Allied lines south of Verdun, held by Germany since 1914. It was a limited objective, and German forces were already preparing to evacuate when the American attack began on September 12, 1918. The offensive was a success, but not because of open warfare tactics. It succeeded because of industrial-scale coordination. The American artillery fired 100,000 shells in 4 hours, the largest American bombardment of the war. American tanks, French Renaults operated by hastily trained American crews, supported the infantry advance. American aircraft, French Espads and British DH-4s, flown by American pilots, provided air support and reconnaissance. The attack was a multi-arm, industrially coordinated assault, exactly the type of warfare Pershing had claimed to reject. The First Army advanced 8 miles in 3 days, capturing 15,000 German prisoners and 450 guns. American casualties were relatively light, 7,000 dead and wounded. It was, by Western Front standards, a stunning success. What made it work was not superior American tactics or the mythical offensive spirit of open warfare. What made it work was overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower. The Germans defending Saint-Mihiel were second-rate units, already planning withdrawal, facing an attacking force 5 times their size, supported by artillery and tanks. Under those conditions, even mediocre tactics produced victory. The final test came in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. 47 days of continuous assault from September 26th to November 11th, 1918. This was the largest American battle of the war. 1.2 million American soldiers, organized into 22 divisions, attacking across a 20-mile front. The objective was to break through the Hindenburg Line, cut the vital rail junction at Sedan, and force German collapse. The terrain was brutal: densely wooded hills, ravines, fortified villages, and a defensive system the Germans had prepared for 4 years. The defenders were veteran units, some of the best remaining in the German army. The First Army attacked with numerical superiority of approximately 5-1. It had more men, more guns, more aircraft, more tanks, and more supplies than the defenders. It should have been a rapid victory. Instead, it became a nightmare of attrition that exposed every weakness in American training and doctrine. The first day went well. American infantry advanced 2 miles against light resistance. Then the advance stalled. Units lost contact with each other in the dense forest. Artillery fire fell on American positions due to poor communication. Supply lines collapsed under the weight of moving hundreds of thousands of men through a few narrow roads. Divisions that were supposed to break through became locked in static warfare, attacking fortified positions with frontal assaults that replicated the slaughters of 1915. The 35th Division attacked Montfaucon, a fortified hill village. The attack bogged down in a tangle of barbed wire and machine gun fire. The division lost 7,300 men in 4 days, gaining less than 2 miles. The 77th Division became trapped in the Argonne forest, surrounded and cut off. The famous Lost Battalion held out for 6 days, suffering 197 dead and 150 wounded out of 554 men before relief arrived. The 79th Division suffered 8,000 casualties in 2 weeks, attacking the same ridgeline repeatedly with no tactical sophistication beyond advance under fire. American commanders responded to failure with the only tool they had: more men. Divisions that were shattered were pulled back and replaced with fresh divisions from the endless pool of reinforcements. The 1st Division was relieved by the 42nd Division. The 42nd was replaced by the 32nd. The 32nd was replaced by the 77th. The 77th was replaced by the 82nd. Each division attacked the same positions, suffered appalling casualties, made incremental gains, and was replaced. By mid-October, the offensive had devolved into a war of attrition eerily similar to the Somme or Verdun. American forces gained an average of 1 mile per week at a cost of 10,000 casualties per mile. The tactics were crude, the casualties were horrific, and the progress was agonizingly slow. But the progress was continuous. That was the key. Germany could not replace its losses. America could. German divisions that were battered at Meuse-Argonne had nowhere to rest, no reserves to relieve them. American divisions that were shattered simply pulled back, received replacements, and returned to the line. The 1st Division, which suffered 8,900 casualties in the offensive, received 9,200 replacements and remained combat effective. The 2nd Division lost 7,300 men, received 8,000 replacements, and attacked again. The arithmetic was relentless. The First Army suffered 117,000 casualties in 47 days, an average of 2,500 per day. But it inflicted estimated casualties of 100,000 on the defenders, and those casualties were irreplaceable. Every German soldier killed or wounded in the Meuse-Argonne was a permanent loss. Every American casualty was a temporary gap in the line, filled within days by fresh replacements arriving from training camps in the United States. By November, German resistance collapsed, not because American tactics improved, but because German divisions ceased to exist as functioning organizations. Regiments that entered the battle at 3,000 men finished at 500. Battalions were down to company strength. There were no reserves. There were no reinforcements. The German army, which had survived 4 years of British and French offensives, broke under the weight of American mass. The Meuse-Argonne offensive was not an American triumph of tactical brilliance. It was an American demonstration that in industrial warfare, mass production of soldiers could substitute for tactical sophistication. German officers who survived the offensive consistently noted the same observations in their after-action reports and post-war memoirs. American soldiers were brave but poorly trained. American officers were aggressive but tactically incompetent. American artillery was abundant but poorly coordinated. American infantry attacked in dense formations that were easy to target. By every measure of tactical quality, the American army was inferior to the British, French, and German armies it fought alongside and against. But the Americans won. They won because tactical quality became less important when numerical superiority reached a certain threshold. They won because they could sustain 1,500 casualties per day, every day, for 47 consecutive days, and still maintain offensive pressure. They won because behind every division in France were 3 more divisions preparing to deploy, and behind those divisions were training camps processing 200,000 new soldiers per month. General Erich Ludendorff, German Chief of Staff, understood this with brutal clarity. In his post-war memoir, he wrote, "The American infantry in the Argonne won through by pure force of numbers. Their losses were enormous, but the stream of replacements was endless. We could kill them faster than any army in history, but we could not kill them faster than they arrived. This was not a battle. This was industrial production applied to human beings." A captured German divisional commander, interrogated in October 1918, stated, "We can defeat any American division in a single engagement. But there are always more divisions. We destroy one, another appears. We destroy that one, 2 more appear. How do you defeat an enemy who treats his soldiers as a renewable resource?" The answer, of course, was that you did not. You could not. The German army in November 1918 was not tactically defeated. German units still held defensive positions, still fought effectively when engaged. But it was exhausted. It had no reserves. It had no replacements. It had no capacity to continue fighting against an enemy that, by the spring of 1919, would field 4 million soldiers in France, backed by limitless industrial production. The price of this industrial approach to warfare was measured in casualty lists. The AEF suffered 3,274 casualties in 19 months of combat, 53,402 killed in action, 63,114 dead from disease and accidents, 204,758 wounded. These numbers were modest compared to French losses, 1.4 million dead, or British losses, 900,000 dead, but they were achieved in a fraction of the time and with a fraction of the tactical experience. The casualty rate per day of combat was revealing. American forces suffered approximately 820 casualties per day of active combat operations, higher than the British average of 650 per day and approaching the French average of 900 per day during the worst years of 1915 to 1917. This was not because American soldiers faced more dangerous conditions. It was because American tactics were less refined, American coordination was poorer, and American commanders relied on mass and aggression rather than tactical finesse. The 77th Division, the melting pot division composed largely of immigrants from New York City, suffered 9,897 casualties in 170 days of combat. Most of these men had been civilians 12 months earlier. They were clerks, factory workers, street vendors. They received 6 months of training with inadequate equipment, were shipped to France, given French rifles and helmets they had never trained with, and thrown into the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Their casualty rate was not a result of bad luck. It was the predictable outcome of sending undertrained troops into industrial combat. The 92nd Division, one of 2 African-American combat divisions, suffered 1,747 casualties while achieving minimal objectives. The division was plagued by poor leadership, white officers who often held racist contempt for their troops, inadequate training, even worse than white divisions, and being assigned impossible missions by commanders who expected them to fail. The division's performance was used by the War Department as evidence that black soldiers were unsuited for combat, a conclusion that ignored the systemic disadvantages imposed on them. Individual units experienced catastrophic losses. The 28th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Division suffered 2,974 casualties, 70% of its strength, in 6 months of combat. The 165th Infantry Regiment of the 42nd Division lost 2,987 men, more than the regiment's original strength, requiring complete replacement of its roster during the war. Companies that entered battle at 250 men finished at 80, were rebuilt with replacements, attacked again, and were destroyed again. These casualties were not tragic failures of planning. They were the expected cost of the American approach to warfare. The General Staff calculated acceptable casualty rates based on replacement capacity. If training camps could produce 200,000 soldiers per month, and if casualties averaged 2,500 per day, 75,000 per month, then the system remained in surplus and offensives could continue indefinitely. This was manpower accounting at industrial scale, treating soldiers as production inputs rather than individuals. The human dimension of this arithmetic was invisible to planners, but devastating to participants. Letters home from Doughboys in the Meuse-Argonne consistently expressed shock at the casualty rates. Private John Lewis of the 89th Division wrote, "Every day we attack. Every day we lose men. Every day new men arrive who don't know anyone's name and don't have time to learn before they're gone too. We're not a company anymore. We're just a number that stays at 250, even though none of us who started are left." Corporal Arthur Jensen of the 82nd Division described the replacement system with bitter precision. "They come off the trucks, we march them to the line, they get killed, and 3 days later, more come off the trucks. The sergeant stopped learning names. What's the point? You call everyone soldier and hope they last long enough to figure out which end of the rifle fires." This was the reality behind the statistics of American mobilization. The industrial production of soldiers meant treating those soldiers as consumable resources, to be expended and replaced with the same cold logic that governed ammunition expenditure. What made the human conveyor system functional, barely, was a logistics operation of unprecedented scale. 2 million American soldiers in France required at minimum 25,000 tons of supplies per day. Food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, clothing, equipment. This material had to cross the Atlantic, be unloaded at French ports, move by rail to forward depots, then by truck to divisional supply points, then by wagon or hand carry to the front lines. The Services of Supply, SOS, commanded by General James Harbord, became the largest logistics organization in American history. At peak strength, the SOS employed 650,000 men, nearly 1/3 of the entire AEF. These were the soldiers who never fought: stevedores unloading ships, railroad engineers moving supplies, truck drivers hauling ammunition, bakers producing bread, butchers processing meat, mechanics repairing vehicles, clerks tracking inventory. The port of Saint-Nazaire processed 12,000 tons of cargo per day. Brest handled 18,000 tons. Bordeaux, Marseille, Le Havre. Each port received continuous streams of American ships, unloading supplies around the clock. The SOS constructed 45 base hospitals, 80 supply depots, 96 locomotive repair shops, and 1,000 miles of railroad to supplement French infrastructure. The food supply alone was staggering. The standard American ration provided 4,760 calories per day, 50% more than French or British rations. reflecting both American abundance and belief that well-fed soldiers fought better. Each soldier received 1 pound of meat per day versus 1/2 pound for Allied troops. The AIF consumed 50,000 tons of food per month. This required continuous shipments of beef from the United States. French cattle production had collapsed during the war. Flour, sugar, coffee, and an astonishing variety of canned goods that European armies had long abandoned for simpler field rations. Ammunition expenditure was equally massive. The First Army fired 200,000 artillery shells during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, an average of 89,000 shells per day. Each shell had to be manufactured, mostly in French factories, shipped to France, transported to forward ammunition dumps, and distributed to artillery batteries. The logistics of moving millions of shells to thousands of guns, coordinating resupply with firing schedules, and preventing stockpile depletion required an accounting system as complex as any civilian business. Medical evacuation demonstrated American logistical efficiency at its most effective. The AEF established a 4-tier evacuation system. Battalion aid stations stabilized casualties. Field hospitals provided emergency surgery. Evacuation hospitals handled serious cases, and base hospitals near ports treated long-term recoveries. Wounded soldiers moved through this system at industrial speed. A soldier wounded in the Argonne forest could receive first aid within 30 minutes, surgery within 6 hours, and be in a rear area hospital within 24 hours. This was faster and more efficient than any previous war's medical system. The result was a survival rate unprecedented in military history. Of American soldiers wounded in combat, 92% survived, compared to 85% in the British Army and 82% in the French Army. This was not because American medics were better trained, they were not, or because American wounds were less severe, they were not. It was because the logistics system moved wounded soldiers through treatment stages with ruthless efficiency, treating casualty evacuation as another production process to be optimized. Yet even this triumph of logistics was insufficient for the scale of operations. Supply lines to the Meuse-Argonne front collapsed repeatedly under the weight of demand. Single-track railroads could not handle the volume of traffic. Trucks broke down faster than mechanics could repair them. Supply dumps ran out of ammunition in mid-offensive, forcing artillery to ration shells. Divisions went days without hot food because field kitchens could not reach them through congested roads. The 35th Division, attacking in late September, ran out of rifle ammunition during a critical phase of its assault. Soldiers stripped cartridges from dead Germans because American supply trucks were stuck in traffic jams 30 miles behind the front. The 77th Division, isolated in the Argonne, received no supplies for 6 days. No food, no ammunition, no medical supplies. Relief efforts included dropping supply bundles from aircraft, but most landed in German-controlled territory. These failures did not stop the offensive. They slowed it, increased casualties, and caused immense suffering. But the attack continued because the fundamental resource, soldiers, remained abundant. When supply failures would have forced European armies to pause and reconstitute their logistics, American commanders simply fed more men into the attack and accepted higher casualties resulting from inadequate support. This was the dark logic of the mass army. Logistics failures that would be catastrophic in a manpower-limited force became merely inefficiencies in a force where human mass could substitute for material efficiency. The entire system, training camps, logistics networks, frontline operations, depended on one critical choke point: the Atlantic crossing. German U-boats sank 6.2 million tons of Allied shipping in 1917. The convoy system reduced losses dramatically, but submarines remained a persistent threat. Every troop ship that departed New York or Newport News risked torpedoing. A single successful U-boat attack on a fully loaded transport could kill 10,000 soldiers, more than died in most battles. The troop ship schedule in 1918 was relentless. In May, 101 voyages carried 245 and 945 troops to France. In June, 111 voyages carried 278,664 troops. In July, 140 voyages carried 306,150 troops. This was not a military movement in the traditional sense. It was industrial mass transportation, comparable to moving an entire city's population across an ocean every month. Conditions aboard the transports were brutal. Ships designed to carry 3,000 passengers in peacetime luxury were reconfigured to carry 10,000 soldiers in wartime austerity. Men slept in shifts, hot bunking in cramped holds with inadequate ventilation. Seasickness was universal. Sanitation was minimal. Disease spread rapidly in the overcrowded conditions. The Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918 killed 45,000 American soldiers, many during the Atlantic crossing or immediately after arrival in France. Yet only 637 soldiers were lost to U-boat attack during the entire war. This was a logistical miracle, transporting 2 million men across submarine-infested waters with a loss rate of 0.03%. Compare this to the Gallipoli campaign, where British planners anticipated 30% losses during the amphibious landing, or the D-Day planning in 1944, which assumed 10,000 casualties in the assault waves. The Atlantic Bridge in 1918 was safer than most combat operations. The key was volume and speed. U-boats could not sink ships they could not catch. The fastest transports, converted ocean liners like the Leviathan, crossed the Atlantic at 23 knots, faster than any submarine could pursue on the surface. Convoys zigzagged at 18 knots, making torpedo targeting difficult. The sheer number of crossings meant that even if U-boats sank one ship per convoy, the percentage loss remained negligible. German Naval Command understood the strategic implications. Admiral Reinhard Scheer, Chief of the Naval Staff, wrote in August 1918, "We sink 30,000 tons of shipping per month. America ships 300,000 tons of soldiers per month. The arithmetic is unsustainable. We cannot win a war of attrition against an enemy whose production of soldiers exceeds our capacity to kill them." This was the fundamental reality that broke German strategic planning. Germany had gambled on defeating France and Britain before American reinforcements arrived in strength. The gamble failed. By summer 1918, American troops were arriving faster than Germany could inflict casualties, and the arrival rate was accelerating. In August, American forces in France increased by 275,000. In September, by 257,000. By October, the AEF numbered 1,867,000 soldiers, larger than. The flood of American manpower created a strategic question. How would these forces be employed? The Allies, desperate for reinforcements after the German spring offensives, wanted American divisions integrated into British and French armies, used as replacements for their own exhausted units. This made tactical sense. American divisions were inexperienced and poorly trained. Placing them under experienced Allied command would minimize casualties and maximize effectiveness. General Pershing rejected this completely. He insisted on maintaining an independent American army, under American command, fighting in an American sector of the front. His reasoning was partly military. He believed American troops would be wasted in Allied-style trench warfare. Partly political. Wilson demanded that America be a co-belligerent, not a subordinate. And partly personal. Pershing refused to serve under foreign command. The cost of this independence was paid in American blood. Allied commanders had 3 years of experience in coordinating combined arms operations. American commanders had none. Allied divisions had refined their tactics through brutal trial and error. American divisions learned the same lessons from scratch at equivalent cost. The British and French were blunt in their assessments. Field Marshal Douglas Haig wrote in his diary after observing American operations at Meuse-Argonne, "The Americans are very brave and determined, but their tactics are those of 1915. They attack with inadequate preparation, poor coordination with artillery, and insufficient attention to machine gun suppression. They suffer casualties we learned to avoid 3 years ago. But they have so many men that they can absorb these losses and continue attacking." French General Philippe Pétain was more scathing. "The American army fights with more courage than skill. They advance because they have unlimited reserves, not because their tactics are sound. If French divisions suffered casualties at American rates, we would have lost the war in 1915. These criticisms were accurate. They were also, from the German perspective, irrelevant. Tactical sophistication mattered less when numerical superiority was overwhelming. American divisions could afford to learn through failure because there were always more divisions to replace them. Pershing's insistence on independence had one decisive advantage. It maintained American political autonomy. When the war ended, America had fielded an independent army that had conducted its own operations and won its own victories. This ensured America's voice at the peace conference and prevented the AEF from being treated as auxiliary forces to the Allies. Whether this political benefit justified the additional casualties is a question historians still debate. By October 1918, German military leadership faced an unsolvable problem. The spring offensives, 5 massive attacks from March to July, had achieved tactical success but strategic failure. German forces advanced 40 miles, reached the Marne River, and came within artillery range of Paris. But the offensives exhausted Germany's last reserves. Casualties exceeded 800,000 men. Elite stormtrooper units that had led the attacks were destroyed. And for all the ground gained, not a single Allied army had been defeated or withdrawn from the war. Meanwhile, American forces arrived at a rate of 10,000 per day. By October, the AEF had grown to nearly 2 million men, with more divisions arriving weekly. Fresh American divisions were replacing exhausted French divisions across the front. The balance of forces, which had slightly favored Germany in March, now overwhelmingly favored the Allies. General Ludendorff calculated the arithmetic of continued war. German forces in France numbered approximately 2.5 million men. But combat strength had declined to perhaps 1.8 million effectives. Divisions were at 60% strength. There were no reserves. Influenza pandemic ravaged rear area units. Civilian morale was collapsing. The British blockade had reduced German food production to starvation level. Against this, the Allies fielded approximately 4.2 million troops, 1.6 million French, 1.4 million British, and 2.0 million American. By spring 1919, American forces would reach 3.5 million, giving the Allies a 5-3 numerical advantage. Germany could not sustain defensive operations against those odds. Every casualty was permanent. Every lost position could not be retaken. Every defeat was irreversible. The breaking point came in September. The Meuse-Argonne offensive, combined with British attacks in Flanders and French attacks in Champagne, stretched German defenses beyond their capacity. Units that had held the line for 4 years began to disintegrate. Officers reported entire companies refusing orders. Desertion rates spiked. Captured prisoners no longer expressed defiance. They expressed relief that their war was over. On September 28th, Ludendorff suffered a nervous breakdown and demanded the government seek an armistice immediately. He had concluded that Germany could not win, could not achieve a draw, and could only minimize defeat by ending the war before American numerical superiority became absolutely crushing. The decision was not based on battlefield defeat. German armies still held defensive positions, still fought effectively, still inflicted casualties. It was based on cold demographic calculus. Germany had mobilized 13.2 million men during the war and suffered 2.4 million dead. The pool of replacement-age males was exhausted. America had mobilized 4.7 million men and suffered 53,000 combat deaths. The pool of replacement-age males was barely touched. By 1919, America could field 6 million soldiers. Germany could field perhaps 2 million. The math was simple and brutal. The armistice took effect at 11:00 a.m. on November 11, 1918. Fighting continued until the final minute. American units attacked German positions that morning, knowing the war would end in hours. The 89th Division assaulted across the Meuse River at 10:30 a.m. The attack was called off at 10:55 a.m. 3 soldiers died in those final 25 minutes. The final casualty lists were counted. The AEF suffered 53,402 combat deaths in 19 months of war. France suffered 1,997,800 combat deaths in 51 months. Britain suffered 886,000. Germany suffered 237,000. Russia suffered 1,800,000. The American contribution in blood was modest by European standards. But the American contribution in manpower mass was decisive. By November 1918, American divisions constituted 31% of Allied combat strength on the Western Front. More importantly, American reinforcement capacity was unlimited. German intelligence estimated that by July 1919, American forces in France would reach 4 million soldiers, giving the Allies a 3-to-1 numerical advantage. Against such odds, no defensive system could hold. German generals in post-war memoirs consistently identified American numerical superiority as the factor that broke their strategic calculus. General Wilhelm Gruner, Ludendorff's replacement, wrote, "We were not defeated by superior tactics or better generals. We were defeated by arithmetic. America's capacity to produce soldiers exceeded our capacity to kill them." This is not war, in the traditional sense. This is industrial production applied to human beings, and we had no counter to it. Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, in his memoir, stated, "The American soldier was inferior in training and discipline to the German soldier. American tactics were crude. American commanders made errors we had corrected years earlier. But none of this mattered. They had millions of men, and we did not. Tactical quality became irrelevant when numerical superiority reached such scale." These assessments, from commanders who had fought the entire war, captured the essential truth of the American transformation. The United States did not win through military brilliance. It won through the industrial production of soldiers at a rate no other nation could match. The statistics of American mobilization: 4.7 million men inducted, 2 million deployed to France, decisive contribution to Allied victory, told a story of triumph. But behind those statistics were costs that never appeared in official reports. The training system that processed 200,000 men per month was brutal in its efficiency. Recruits who could not meet physical standards were discharged without ceremony. Those who could not achieve minimum marksmanship scores were assigned to labor battalions. Those who could not endure the psychological stress broke down and were quietly removed from service. The system's 80% throughput rate, meaning 80% of inductees eventually deployed, was celebrated as efficiency. The 20% who were rejected, discharged, or broken represented 940,000 men whose experience of military service was failure and rejection. The Spanish influenza pandemic killed 45,000 American soldiers, nearly as many as died in combat. Most deaths occurred in the training camps, where overcrowded conditions created perfect environments for disease transmission. Camp Funston, Kansas, where the pandemic may have originated, saw 100 soldiers hospitalized with influenza in a single week in March 1918. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. Men died in hospital corridors because there were no beds. The Army continued inducting new recruits and packing them into the same barracks, prioritizing deployment schedules over public health. The replacement system that maintained division strength was psychologically devastating. Soldiers who survived battles returned from leave to find their companies filled with strangers. The continuity and cohesion that characterized professional armies, where men fought alongside comrades they had trained with for years, did not exist in the American mass army. Units were perpetual rotations of replacements, never developing the institutional identity that sustained morale in European forces. Private Daniel McCarthy of the 26th Division wrote, "I joined the company in July. By September, everyone I knew was gone, dead, wounded, or transferred. The new men didn't know the old stories, didn't know the officers' quirks, didn't know anything. We weren't a company. We were just whoever happened to be assigned to that number at that moment." This psychological cost, the alienation and isolation of serving in a unit with no stable identity, was never quantified but was pervasive in letters and diaries from American soldiers. European armies maintained regimental traditions, preserved unit identities, and created cohesion through shared history. American divisions were industrial units, their personnel as interchangeable as machine parts. The African-American experience was particularly brutal. Segregated, commanded by white officers who often held racist views, assigned primarily to labor rather than combat roles, and facing discrimination both within the Army and in French society. Black soldiers experienced the war's costs without receiving its honors. The 92nd Division's mixed combat record was used to justify continued segregation in the interwar army. The 93rd Division's success fighting under French command was ignored. When black soldiers returned home, they faced the same racism they had left, with the added bitterness of having fought for a country that denied them basic rights. The American mobilization of 1917 to 1918 was not militarily elegant. It was industrially overwhelming. What the United States demonstrated was that modern warfare could be reduced to production logistics. If a nation could produce soldiers faster than the enemy could kill them, produce equipment faster than it could be destroyed, and transport supplies faster than they could be consumed, then tactical sophistication became less critical. Mass could substitute for skill. Volume could overcome quality. This was not a new insight. Napoleon had understood that numbers matter, but it had never been implemented at such scale or speed. America did not invent mass mobilization. It industrialized it, applying assembly line methods to transform the process from a slow accumulation of military strength to a rapid production surge. The training camp system processed soldiers like Ford factories, processed automobiles, standardized inputs, systematized transformation, uniform outputs. The shipping system moved troops like railroads moved freight, scheduled departures, optimized loading, maximum throughput. The replacement system maintained division strength, like inventory management maintained factory production, continuous resupply, immediate replacement of losses, zero tolerance for stockpile depletion. The result was military effectiveness achieved not through excellence, but through sufficiency at scale. American soldiers were adequately trained, adequately equipped, and adequately led. That adequacy, multiplied by millions, proved decisive. Allied reactions to the American military performance were mixed. British officers respected American courage while deploring American tactics. French commanders appreciated American reinforcements while despairing at American casualty rates. Both recognized that American mass had saved them from defeat, but both questioned whether the cost was necessary. General Maxime Weygand, Foch's chief of staff, wrote in November 1918, "The Americans won the war for us, but they paid a price in blood we had learned to avoid. They attacked like we did in 1915, with inadequate artillery preparation, poor coordination, and excessive confidence in infantry assault. They suffer casualties that shock even French veterans. But they have so many men that these losses do not stop them. This is a new kind of warfare, victory through demographic superiority, rather than tactical skill." Field Marshal Haig was more blunt in private correspondence. "The American army is lavishly equipped, abundantly supplied, and recklessly wasteful of lives. They fight with a determination that is admirable and a tactical crudeness that is appalling. But in modern war, perhaps determination and mass matter more than skill." German officers, in contrast, expressed a kind of horrified fascination. They had mastered the tactical art of defensive warfare, perfecting systems to maximize enemy casualties while minimizing their own. American forces disregarded these calculations entirely. They accepted casualty rates that would cause British or French offensives to be suspended, then continued attacking. The German tactical advantage, accumulated through years of experience, became strategically irrelevant when facing an enemy who could absorb unlimited losses. A German regimental commander, in a post-war interrogation, captured this perfectly. "We knew how to defeat the Americans in battle. We could not discover how to defeat an enemy who lost battles but continued advancing, who suffered casualties that should have broken any army, but simply brought up more troops, who fought poorly, but fought endlessly." When the final statistics were compiled, the American mobilization scale became clear. The United States inducted 4,791,272 men into military service between April 1917 and November 1918, 19 months. At peak mobilization, the U.S. Army was inducting 8,700 men per day, one new soldier every 10 seconds around the clock. The training system processed 3,685,000 soldiers through its camps, with 2,186,000 reaching France before the Armistice. The shipping system transported soldiers at an average rate of 5,700 per day from May to November 1918. A human conveyor belt that moved the equivalent of a division across the Atlantic every 3 days. The industrial production to support this force was equally massive. American factories produced 200,000 rifles, 675,000 machine guns, though most arrived too late for combat use, 10 billion rounds of ammunition, 18 million artillery shells, and 550,000 tons of explosives. The Emergency Fleet Corporation launched 9,000 tons of shipping. The Railroad Administration moved 7,000 tons of military freight. The financial cost was $32 billion, more than the entire U.S. federal budget for the previous 30 years combined. Approximately $22 billion was spent in the United States and $10 billion in Europe. The national debt increased from $1.2 billion to $25 billion, a 20-fold increase in 19 months. The human cost was 116,516 American deaths, 53,402 in combat, 63,114 from disease and accidents. Another 204,002 were wounded. These numbers were modest by European standards, but represented a casualty rate of 7.1% of deployed forces, higher than the US would suffer in World War II, 6.7%, or Korea, 2.4%. But the cost that could not be quantified was the transformation of American society. The nation that entered the war in April 1917, isolationist, unprepared, with a tiny peacetime army, emerged in November 1918 as a military power that had fielded the decisive force in history's largest war. America had demonstrated a capacity for military mobilization that dwarfed anything in its past. The nation that had struggled to maintain an army of 200,000 in peacetime had deployed 2,000 overseas and could have deployed twice that number if the war had continued. This transformation was not forgotten. When World War II began, American planners understood what their nation was capable of. Not military brilliance, but industrial production of military force at a scale no other nation could match. The lessons of 1917 to 1918, that America's strength lay in mass production, logistical supremacy, and the ability to sustain casualties through sheer demographic surplus, would shape American military strategy for the next century. On November 11, 1918, at the moment the armistice took effect, there were 284,000 American soldiers in France. Another 1,982,000 were in training camps in the United States, scheduled for deployment in 1919. Behind them, the Selective service system was preparing to induct another 100,000 men in the first 6 months of 1919. The training camps were expanding to a capacity of 3,000 men. The shipping system was accelerating toward 400,000 troops per month. The industrial system was finally reaching full production of American-designed weapons. If the war had continued into 1919, the American army in France would have numbered 4,000 soldiers by summer, larger than the combined French and British forces. The weight of this mass, not its skill, not its equipment, not its tactics, but simply its overwhelming numerical presence, would have crushed German resistance through pure arithmetic. This was the transformation that General Scott could not foresee when he stood at his window in April 1917. America did not create a professional army. It created an industrial army, a mass-produced force that substituted quantity for quality, throughput for elegance, and relentless numerical pressure for tactical sophistication. The Germans had mastered the art of war. The Americans had mastered the arithmetic of war. In the end, arithmetic proved decisive. The doughboy, that average American soldier of 1918, was not a better fighter than his German opponent. He was less experienced, less skilled, less tactically proficient. But he was one of 4 million, backed by a nation that could produce soldiers faster than they could be killed. In industrial warfare, that sufficiency multiplied by mass was enough. The transformation from April 1917 to November 1918 was not a military miracle. It was an industrial process applied to human beings, executed with ruthless efficiency and accepted human costs. America did not win the war through genius. It won through the cold mathematics of production, more soldiers arriving faster, sustained longer than any enemy could withstand. The German assessment was correct. This was not war in the traditional sense. This was industrial production applied to warfare. And it proved unstoppable. The age of the mass army had arrived, and America had demonstrated that in that age, industrial capacity would trump military tradition. The lessons learned in the forests of France would echo through every American war that followed. When America goes to war, it does not fight elegantly. It fights industrially, burying opponents under a tide of men and material that no amount of tactical skill can ultimately resist. This was the Doughboy transformation, not from civilian to soldier, but from nation to war machine.